And of course, Hong Kong was the subject of a bilateral international treaty between the People's Republic of China and the United Kingdom, a treaty that if China does not abide by it, will call into question China's ability to live up to its words and promises.
We'll be coming back to that in just a moment. You're listening to Asia News Weekly, a digest from the Asia-Pacific region. Hong Kong calls for democracy. What will China do in Xinjiang? And just where is Kim Jong-un? These stories and more are on the October 3rd edition of Asia News Weekly. Welcome to the podcast, everyone. I'm your host, Steve Miller, and I want to thank you for downloading and listening to this week's edition of Asia News Weekly. When I was in high school, I was always fascinated by the news, and if I turn back the hands of time to that last semester in high school, I remember seeing the unrest in Beijing, that of course culminated in the student-led protests in Tiananmen Square, and unfortunately, the subsequent massacre. It left me absolutely horrified at what a government could do to stifle personal freedoms. Now, we flash forward to present day in 2014, and the residents of Hong Kong, the former British colony, are rising up once more. They're seeking the right to elect their own officials. It's something that they've asked for repeatedly, universal suffrage. China rebuked that call, opting to give Hong Kong residents the power to vote in 2017, but only on candidates that they themselves choose. And it's most likely that those candidates would be pro-Beijing, much like current Chief Executive Leung. It's something that Hong Kong residents, well, at least many of them, feel is unacceptable. What they asked for was true universal suffrage, the right to freely choose who runs in an election and who they can choose to vote for. It's a frightening prospect to the one-party system of Beijing and China, and their request was quickly silenced. The residents in Hong Kong, of course, vowed peaceful protest to voice their objections. And before long, the Occupy Central movement was born. Last week, college students took to the streets, boycotting classes and the restrictions placed on their future. What started out as only a few thousand quickly grew, so much so that the official organizers of Occupy Central decided to move up their planned demonstrations on October 1st to coincide with the student movement. Listener Priscilla Kong summed up the overall sentiment in Hong Kong. I'm a Hong Konger. Although protesters have held their hands in the air to show that they are not armed, police still use pepper spray, tear gas, and occasionally welded batons against protesters. Protesters did nothing wrong. They protested in peace. I don't see any reason to bring out the riot police and use tear gas. I hope every protester will be safe and sound. As Priscilla mentioned, the riot police used tear gas 87 times to try and disperse Occupy Central and student-led pro-democracy advocates. The riot police were ultimately withdrawn, but that only seemed to turn the tide in favor of the Occupy Central movement, bringing more people out into the streets. And every step of the way, the pro-democracy protesters made it clear that they wanted universal suffrage, that they wanted it now, and there could be no substitute. They issued an ultimatum to Chief Executive Leung: step down and give us what we want on October 1st, China's National Day, the day celebrating the foundation of Communist China. Leung repeatedly called the Occupy Central movement illegal and ordered those assembled to disperse. Of course, Leung didn't step down, and organizers then had to retreat a little and extend their deadline to October 2nd. As of this recording, Leung is still the chief executive of Hong Kong. This means, according to statements by Occupy Central organizers, that they will move forward with their plans to expand the protest and try to occupy government buildings once more. Fearing their communication will be cut off, protesters have turned to FireChat, a peer-to-peer messaging program that's independent of the internet and also the cellular networks in Hong Kong. It simply can't be shut down, and it's been used to quickly spread the word on where to assemble. Judy Chow, a student protester, says, We're using it as a platform to communicate the latest news and what's needed in Admiralty and Causeway Bay. I find Fire Chat is a useful tool to update us on plans for necessary action. Once the government has cut the web, we can rely on Fire Chat. While the government is censoring news inside China, videos of the peaceful protests have populated social media outlets. We see the Occupy Central members gathering on the streets. We've seen the riot police using tear gas and pepper spray. And we've seen sweeping aerial flybys showing those assembled amongst the giant skyscrapers. But how did we arrive at this junction? It all goes back to 1997 and the handoff between Britain and China. As part of the deal struck with China in 1997, it was promised that residents would be able to freely democratically elect their chief executive beginning in 2017. In 2007, that promise was made again, but under Beijing's current plan, as you can see, that's not the case. British Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg said on Tuesday, September 30th, that he'd be summoning the Chinese ambassador to express his dismay and alarm. Quote, "The Chinese authorities in Beijing seem determined to refuse to give to the people of Hong Kong what they are perfectly entitled to expect, which is free, fair, open elections based on universal suffrage, as guaranteed by the joint declarations signed by the Chinese and British governments." End quote. It's that change that has galvanized the world to support the so-called umbrella revolution, to peacefully protest under Hong Kong's rule of law in opposition to Beijing. Given the heavy-handed nature Beijing used to quell Tiananmen Square, which has already drawn parallels to the current situation, and China's efforts to reel in violence in Xinjiang, I asked RAND Corporation's Scott Harold if any insights could be taken away from China's activities up north.
I think it's much different for several reasons. One would be China essentially has the ability to shut off Xinjiang from the outside world, including turning off the internet, including preventing foreign journalists from entering, or foreigners more broadly from entering Xinjiang. They have a narrative framework that they can place Xinjiang within that describes Xinjiang as an integral territorial part of China, as well as a terrorist problem, which will certainly win it some understanding in some quarters of the outside world. On the other hand, in Hong Kong, you have a territory that was handed over only as recently as 1997, a very distinctive identity that's different from mainland China. Even though they are themselves ethnically Chinese. They speak a different language. China does not have the garrison capacity in Hong Kong. They have about 6,000 troops from the PLA in Hong Kong, but they are not anywhere near as dominant a force or as visible a force as they are in Xinjiang. And of course, you have a very different set of interests at play in Hong Kong, with the international community having major corporations and large amounts of Chinese money invested in Hong Kong that is at risk. And of course, Hong Kong was the subject of a bilateral international treaty between the People's Republic of China and the United Kingdom, a treaty that if China does not abide by it, will call into question China's ability to live up to its words and promises. Moreover, the Hong Kong issue poses a different problem for China in that Hong Kong was always presented as the model for how China would like to resolve the dispute across the Taiwan Strait with Taiwan. The notion being that within China's framework, both of these sides of the Taiwan Strait are part of one country, but that one country might be permitted to have two very different systems, i.e. a liberal democratic capitalist system in Hong Kong and one day applying the same model in Taiwan, whereas the one-party dictator, Communist Party dictatorship with state control of the commanding heights of the economy would prevail in China. That is not a model that will be very appealing right now in Taiwan. It would be even less so if China were to suddenly decide to use a bloodbath to cow the Hong Kong people into submission. If that would even work, which I think is a very open question.
Chinese President Xi Jinping views Hong Kong as an integral part of the nation, and it would be better served coming completely into the fold with Beijing. something he has made crystal clear during his National Day address. Leung keeps toting the state line, saying that Hong Kongers should be thankful for the limited electoral freedoms that they have, a move that only serves to rile up dissent. To go one step further, both Xi and Leung have made it clear that they view this as an illegal protest, that they view this as an internal matter, and that outsiders should not only refrain from commentary, but involvement. Given the current situation, Chief Executive Leung won't stay in power much longer. He's lost. At the very least, he needs to step down and allow a fresh voice to be heard from the government to allow the healing to begin. So, where do we go from here? That happens to be a very good question. Analysts like to point to 4 different options. Option 1, the movement continues to gain momentum, and that's certainly the situation currently, as National Day has seen more people become involved and take to the streets, but it's unclear how long those that are currently on the streets will stay there. Option 2 says that the momentum will falter. It's unlikely Beijing will cave into the demands of Occupy Central, despite that clearly being the thing it's obligated to do under the joint declaration with Britain. Some protesters have also voiced opinions that they feel that there is absolutely nothing they can do to really affect change. But not voicing their opinion and letting their feelings known on the subject just wasn't an option. A third option might have Hong Kong authorities issue orders to forcibly remove the protesters from Occupy Central locations. It's true the riot police have been withdrawn, but their use wasn't fully taken off the table. Beijing usually lets local governments take care of situations like this, and it could be Leung's next order. The final option, and perhaps the most terrifying prospect, is that Beijing takes action. The party has said it will not reconsider its position and published an editorial in the People's Daily on October 2nd. The wording and tone of that editorial mimicked what was released leading up to the Tiananmen Square massacre. The editorial called the Occupy Central members radical activists, blamed foreign influences, and concluded with this: if a few people are determined to go against the rule of law and provoke disturbances, in the end, they will reap what they have sown. What will transpire next in Hong Kong is unknown. The island has reached an important crossroads, and its future uncertain. Be sure to follow Asia News Weekly on Twitter and Facebook for updates, and listen to the Asia Brief Monday through Thursday for more stories. Later in the program, I speak to Rand Corporation's Bruce Bennett about what to make out of North Korea's Kim Jong-un's 3-week disappearance from the media and rumors that he's no longer in control. Officials in Xinjiang, the northern region of China, are in the middle of a year-long crackdown on violence, trying to curb what they call acts of terrorism. Just last week, Uighur scholar Ilham Tohti was convicted on separatism charges. And immediately following that conviction, rioters blew themselves up according to Chinese state media in Luntai County, killing a total of 54 people, including civilians and police officers. I asked Scott Harold, a sociopolitical scientist at the Rand Corporation, what China's strategy in Xinjiang was, and has it been effective?
Well, I think that their approach is effective in the terms within which they have defined it. If the primary emphasis is ensuring that physical control over Xinjiang is maximized without concern for the consequences for the people who live there, then they have ensured that they have the physical capacity to garrison Xinjiang. However, by the standards of the international human rights documents that China has signed and agreed to, and by global normative standards that call for treating people in an area with decency and respect, I think it's quite clear that their hardline approach to trying to stamp out political dissent or dissatisfaction with central government policies has not worked. And the evidence of that is that most of the people who we are seeing carry out these attacks, or in some cases who are alleged who have carried out attacks, since we rarely get to hear from the individuals themselves. They're not put on a public trial. They're not given an opportunity to explain themselves. They are widely believed to be carrying out these attacks as a consequence of Chinese policy or in reaction to Chinese policy, as opposed to doing so and Chinese policy responds to them. So I can point you to things like people saying, well, they tore down our mosque, or they prohibited me from growing my beard, or they forced my wife to uncover her head. I think Chinese policy is not the only factor here. There are obviously considerations in the wider world, including that subset of the world that constitutes the various dimensions of the Islamic community and the various aspects of cross-border ethnic communities, Uighur communities or Central Asian communities more broadly. But I think that the greatest part of what we're seeing is a reaction by the Uighur community in Xinjiang against Chinese policies that are perceived as discriminatory and as disadvantageous and as repressing their identity.
You've heard from Scott, but now let's hear from you. What do you think it will take to end the violence in Xinjiang? Do you think China is standing on the precipice of unleashing its military might throughout its territory to bring in opposition? Leave your comments on the webpage, on Facebook, or reply through Twitter. If you'd like to know more about this or any of the other stories mentioned in this week's podcast, take a look at the show notes over at AsianNewsWeekly.net. More than 3 weeks have passed since we've last seen Kim Jong-un, the young leader of North Korea. He's been out of the public eye he's so carefully and diligently been courting since assuming control nearly 3 years ago. In fact, he missed the Second Supreme People's Assembly held this year, a rubber stamp for his government that was held last week. For the first time, the nation, the DPRK, has announced that their invulnerable leader was sick, and as they put it, he was feeling some discomfort. Some say he has gout, others diabetes. There's even been reports that he has a fractured ankle. With some key military personnel changes, some have even proposed that there was a coup and that his sister is now in control of the country. Just what can we believe? Bruce Bennett, senior defense analyst with the Rand Corporation, fills us in.
I think, first of all, North Korea and Kim Jong-un, certainly as a member of the Kim family, are anxious to have North Korea always be in the limelight. After all, from their perspective, North Korea is one of the superpowers of the world. And so the fact that they're off the radar screen quite commonly is not good for them in terms of their internal political position. And capturing so much attention over Kim's health probably is a very favorable thing as far as their media perspective is concerned. That said, the stories about his having broken ankles, I find that very difficult to believe. I mean, it's not impossible, but somehow he hurt his ankle and then broke both ankles in the aftermath. Just seems to be a little bit implausible. So from that, I guess I would go on to say that we don't really know what is going on. It could be a number of things, and could well be health care or whatever, but I think the regime stirred up enough concern and interest in the subject that now they're trying to make it look like it's not a big deal and he's really okay and he's still in control, though the latest story in the South Korean press is that his sister is now in control.
During this last parliament session, there were a few key military changes. What do you make of them?
Well, his father was always very careful not to let anybody on that second tier of leadership get too powerful. So even during his father's time period, Jang Sung-taek was taken out of responsible positions on 2 different occasions. The biggest difference is that under his father, when people were removed from power, Sometimes they were able to come back, as Chiang did in both cases. Kim Jong-un seems to be signaling that you've got an opportunity, but if I get rid of you, you're much less likely to come back and may suffer the same results as my uncle. That is a pretty serious change. Now, what is really going on? Fundamentally, we don't know. They have denied that information. Could there be a military coup going on? Could be. We wouldn't necessarily know until things had better developed and somebody had taken control and was able to exercise that, and that doesn't seem to have happened. So probably hasn't been a military coup, but you can't rule it out.
Dr. Bennett, thank you for joining me this week.
All righty, certainly.
The U.S. Korea Institute at Johns Hopkins University said on its 38 North website, satellite imagery seems to show that the Sohae launch facility appears to have the capacity to finally launch long-range missiles, something the DPRK has been planning since at least April of last year. The images don't show that a launch is imminent, but that one may be in the not-too-distant future. It's always difficult to know just for sure what is taking place in Pyongyang, but what do you think is the story of the missing Kim Jong-un? Why has he been absent these past few weeks? One note of interest, The Guardian reports that Dennis Rodman has told TMZ that he'll be heading back to North Korea in November, but he dodged specific questions relating to Kim Jong-un. If Kim Jong-un doesn't surface before then, we may have that clear picture of what took place inside North Korea before too long. We're approaching the end of the episode, meaning that it's time for the weekly brief. Interning this week with Asia News Weekly has been Judy Lee, and she takes the reins.
Let's kick this off with a major film festival that's happening in Korea right now, the 19th Busan International Film Festival. It started yesterday, October 2nd, and will run until the 11th. One particular film that is attracting attention is the world premiere of Diving Bell, a documentary film that depicts the Seoul ferry disaster that claimed more than 300 lives, 250 of them which were high school students. Critics say the film is insensitive or overly politicized and have demanded to scrap the screening, but organizers have stood by their decision to screen the film as planned. The screening will feature a total of 312 films from 79 countries. Now, an update to the Mount Ontake eruption that happened last Saturday, Japan's worst volcanic casualty in 88 years. Despite at least 24 victims still entrapped on the mountain, the rescue search has been called off due to worries of another volcanic activity, predicting another big eruption. Most movie fans have probably heard of DreamWorks Animations, the creators of Shrek and How to Train Your Dragon series. The Japanese telecoms group SoftBank is speculated to be purchasing DreamWorks Animations, the biggest independent animated film studio in the U.S. According to a Hollywood Reporter, the potential price for the deal that SoftBank proposed is at $3.4 billion. DreamWorks Animations founder and CEO Jeffrey Katzenberg is reported to be staying with the company for 5 years, and this deal would make SoftBank the second Japanese technology company to buy a Hollywood studio following Sony Corporations. A senior Japanese foreign ministry official, Junichi Ihara, met with the North Korean ambassador Song Il-ho on Monday for an investigation on the Japanese abduction case which occurred throughout the 1970s and 80s. North Korea stated that a scientific and objective investigation is ongoing, but there was no concrete result to the report. Instead, they invited Ihara to pay a visit to Pyongyang personally to resolve the issue. Japanese people were abducted and taken to North Korea decades ago to help train spies. In 2002, North Korea admitted to kidnapping 13 Japanese citizens, 5 abductees whom returned to Japan, but the remaining 8 were confirmed dead. Abe has not yet said whether Japan planned to go along with Song's proposal. An American, Matthew Todd Miller, began his 6-year sentence of hard labor in North Korea starting from September 25th. He was caught committing hostile acts, the North accusing Miller of ripping up his visa on his arrival to the country so that he can go to prison and expose the human rights violations. Miller wrote a letter asking U.S. officials for help, those officials including former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and First Lady Michelle Obama. In contrast to this apparent violation of human rights, North Korea recently published a 53,000-word report on their superior human rights system. According to a report by the DPRK Association for Human Rights Studies, it states that its political system bestows upon its citizens priceless political integrity, and their economic system ensures people an independent and creative working life, as well as affluent and civilized living standard. The report made no mention of its prison systems or food shortages. The issuing of this report is a timely response to the UN Commission of Inquiry report, where they blame North Korea for terrorizing its own citizens.
Those are all the stories for this week's show, but let's take a moment and hear what you had to say in the comments from last time. Zachary Thompson commented on our Asia Now podcast about the Senkaku Diaoyu dispute. Loved this interview. Great job setting up the background and explaining the legal perspective. I would argue Japan has the only legitimate claim to the Senkakus based on the presented evidence. Just going on post-World War II history, Chiang Kai-shek had ample opportunity as leader of China and U.S. ally to claim the islands from Japan, but did not. That, in my opinion, destroys the Communist Party line that China owns them. Wendy commented on our update about the Chinese man receiving the 3D modeled surgery. Such a sad case for the Chinese man. Hope the surgery goes well, and he's able to regain the ability to speak and write. And I have to add, don't we all? Just the fact that he was starting to show signs of improvements after the surgery is an incredibly great sign. And this last comment isn't from one of our podcasts, but actually in response to one of the news stories we shared on Twitter this week. Dimitri Perrin wrote, "What? Japan is a great place in many aspects, but really needs to get its act together." Dimitri tweeted this reply in response to what many in Japan are calling maternity harassment. Again, thank you so much for leaving these comments. I truly do value them, and I look forward to reading your comments and hopefully hearing your comments to the stories that we shared in this week's episode. You can, of course, leave those comments on our website, but also you can share them on our Facebook page or reply through Twitter. If you haven't found us on Facebook and Twitter, the address on Facebook, well, it's facebook.com/Asian News Weekly. And on Twitter, you guessed it, @Asian News Weekly. If you would like to send us that voice comment, just fire up your Skype and dial Asian News Weekly. If you do leave a voicemail message, please include your name and where you're calling from. You can also send an email to this show with your questions, feedbacks, or even comments. Just fire up your email client and message asiannewsweekly@gmail.com. You can, of course, play and download all of our episodes from our website, but you'll also be able to find the Asian News Weekly podcast on sites like the Korea Times, Japan Today, and Asia Pundits. But if you prefer the show in podcast form, look for us on Stitcher, iTunes, and TuneIn. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends and subscribe to the podcast so you won't miss the next one. Well, my friends, that is it for today. Thank you again for listening. For Asia News Weekly, I'm Steve Miller. Asia News Weekly is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License.